Thank you. So to start with, just move to the next slide. Yes, thank you. So, dear all, if we see the history of the wildlife laws, so it is not that 1972 Act, which we all know we have in place today, that it's only uh, in 1972 that such legislations were passed for the protection and conservation of the wildlife in India. Not only that, during the British rule, that uh, the laws were enacted. It is far more if we trace the history. So India has been advocating the rights for the wildlife, and such rules have been framed. And not only that, these were all customary laws. If you trace the Indian legal history, and starting from the time of Arthashastra, which is like back in the 3rd century BC, the most intriguing part for me is that you would see that it is not the customary laws which we had in India. These are all codified laws. So these were all codified written laws. And one of the example which we can see is the Arthashastra, which was written by the great economist Kautilya, which we all know in India. So in that Arthashastra, which is more so of book on the economics, but we'll find a lot about the protection and the conservation of the wildlife and forest. Interestingly, even in that time in India, you would see that in the 3rd century BC, we had the positions of the forest superintendents in India. And not only that, there were the concept of national parks, like there were lands which were notified as wildlife sanctuaries and national parks. And you would see that in Sanskrit, it's mentioned on the screen. I apologize. I think the content is not that much visible, but I'll read for my participants that the words were like Abhivanya, which means national park, and they were positions of the forest superintendents. So not only Arthashastra, you will see Rig Veda, which is one of the oldest Vedic book which we have. So you'll see the Vedas, like Rig Vedas talks about the protection of the wildlife and the animals. Then we have Kautilya, and then in 3rd century BC, when we talk about the great ruler of India, the King Ashoka. Please come to the next slide. So if you see the King Ashoka, very famous empire which he had, one of the biggest in India during the ancient history of India. So King Ashoka, in fact, came up with a decree, a legal decree, wherein, like, if we compare it with today's legislations, the way we have schedules in the Protection Act. So similarly, even in that time, King Ashoka had a decree wherein there was a small schedule wherein some animals were actually mentioned, and those animals were prohibited to be hunted in India. So King Ashoka, back in 3rd century BC, came up with this decree wherein the number of animals which were named in the decree is mentioned on the slide. You'll see there were mynas, there were parrots, wild geese, and cranes and whatnot. So there was this schedule back in the time of King Ashoka. So when we trace the history, so it's very much evident that India has been advocating for the protection of the wildlife and for the conservation of the wild animals and the forest. So not only during the ancient times, but then later on with the advent of the British Raj in India, we'll see that the number of legislations were passed. So to start with, just put to the next slide. So you'll see history of wildlife laws in India. So there were number of legislations which were passed during the British Raj, and few of them have been mentioned on the slide. So these were on India level, then there were state level legislations, for example, Tamil Nadu Wild Elephant Preservation Acts. So this is during the modern history of India, when we see that there were also number of legislations which were passed by the British Parliament that time, and the first time Indian Forest Act was enacted back in 1879. It started with 1878. Then number of times it was amended. Then we had the United Provinces National Parks Act, which is today's Uttar Pradesh in India. So for Uttar Pradesh also we had this law back in 1935. So these are all the modern history legislations which were passed for the protection of wildlife and the forest. Next slide, please. So now coming to the today's theme about the Wildlife Protection Act. So what prompted, if we see in brief, the passing of this new legislation named the Wildlife Protection Act 1972. So one of the reason which prompted the Indian Parliament was the Stockholm Conference. The then Prime Minister, Miss Indira Gandhi, was taking part in the Stockholm Conference. And you will see once the Indian delegation was back, and the will of passing such legislation for the protection of environment and the wildlife is very much palpable. Post the Stockholm Conference, that number of legislations were actually passed in India. Whether it's the Wildlife Protection Act, you see the Environment Protection Act, and there were many pollution legislations which were also passed. So Stockholm Conference is one of the reason, not the main, I would say, for the enactment of the today's Wildlife Protection Act 1972. Next. Next slide. So yes, one before it. I think you have yes. Thank you. So you see now the 1972 Act. One of the major reason of passing of this legislation was that the punishments which were there in the local laws, and when I say local laws, so they were laws which were only operational in a concerned state or in a concerned province. So the punishments were not commensurating with the benefits which were accruing with the illegal wildlife trade and wildlife poaching. So in the mid 90s, in the mid 19th century, you'll see that the financial benefits which were accruing out of the commercial hunting and poaching of the wildlife animals and the illegal traffic was not at par with the punishment. So the deterrent effect which we require, the fear of law which was required, was not there. And there was no national level legislation which was addressing the commercial trade of wildlife, the prohibition in the commercial trade of the wildlife in India. So they were all state level, local level legislations which were addressing the hunting, and the punishments were actually very less. There were legislation where, in fact, the fine was very less. So there was this requirement of consolidating, having a pan India law which can address the menace of the wildlife hunting, and not only the wildlife hunting but the illegal trade which was happening in India, which was very much prevalent on the commercial level. So few of the states in India actually approached the Parliament of India. The name of the states are mentioned at the clause C, and you can see that these states included Punjab, Uttar Pradesh, West Bengal, Haryana, Bihar, Manipur, etc. So all these states actually passed a resolution under the Constitution of India, praying for a pan-India legislation which has an effect on the entire territory of India, which can address the menace of the commercial trade in the wildlife. So this was one of the reason that one of the major reasons that the Wildlife Protection Act 1972 was enacted. So this brief introduction to some of the phases by which the Indian legal history has gone through when it comes to the protection and the conservation of the wildlife. Now we'll talk about the latest amendments which have taken place, how much it is beneficial, what all problems they have addressed while passing this amendment. So we'll now come to the amendments, and please put to the next slide. Yes. So now you will see that this recent amendment of 2022. Devo, next slide. Yes. So on your screen, you can see some of the salient features of the Amendment Act, which we'll be discussing today. So invasive species have been addressed, and how we can eradicate the menace of invasive species have also been addressed in the Amendment Act. What is invasive species has also been defined in the Act. WCCB, which is the central government's nodal agency for detecting the wildlife crime, they have been given the, I think there is some text message if somebody has some query. All right, we'll take the questions later on. Thank you. So we'll get back to the queries. So yes, so I was talking about the Wildlife Crime Control Bureau, which is a statutory authority enacted under the Wildlife Protection Act. So very categorically, they have been empowered to take cognizance of the offences and to file the complaint. Till now, you would see that it's missing. The WCCB through Ministry of Environment was launching the prosecution. So Wildlife Crime Control Bureau, as we all know, is the statutory body constituted under the Wildlife Protection Act. The role is to collate intelligence and to disseminate it to the other states, to investigate the crime, to detect the offences, and finally to prosecute. So now to prosecute, the agency's name have been mentioned in the relevant section, which talks about the authorities which are empowered to take the cognizance. So we'll talk about all these. Now there is an increase of penalties in the offences. Earlier, there were few things which was lacking, because the enhancement of penalty, we all know that it has a deterrent effect. Anybody, if few of the people, if they want me to take the session both in English and Hindi, so please mention that in the chat box. So I can take the session both in English and Hindi. I can blend the lecture with English. So please let me know if somebody is not comfortable with English. So further inclusion of species under CITES, that's one of the most important feature of this Amendment Act, that the CITES listed species have been added, and it's a great relief when it comes to the offences that were taking place in India in terms of the exotic bird trade or exotic animals which were traded in India. So there was a big lacuna in the domestic legislation, the Wildlife Protection Act, which has been addressed, that the CITES listed species have now been added in the Wildlife Protection Act. So all the exotic, all the international species, the foreign species which are not part of, which are not native to India, have also been given protection under the legislation, the Wildlife Protection Act. And there are other features which we will talk. Another intriguing feature is that Customs and Indian Coast Guard have been empowered to detect offences in the Wildlife Protection Act. So we'll start with the enforcement agencies now. What all enforcement agencies have been empowered? So you see, with this Amendment Act, the Indian Customs have been empowered to detect the offence. And the important power which have been given the see, customs is actually detecting offences at the exit points, which means at the borders of the Indian territory, whether it's the coastal borders or whether it's the land borders. So there the customs were even before this amendment was investigating and detecting offences which involved evading of the customs duty, and they are only discharging their duties under the Customs Act. Now, what the Wildlife Protection Act have empowered the Indian customs is that not only at the exit point, but at the hinterland. Hinterland means domestic land. For example, Delhi, we don't have a international borders. So Indian customs, although we have Indian customs, they do have jurisdiction in the Delhi to raid as per the Customs Act. But for the wildlife offenses, before this amendment, customs were not having the power to actually detect offenses pertaining to wildlife in the domestic land. They were only detecting the offenses at the exit point at the international borders, and that was also only under the Customs Act. Now, the Indian customs have been empowered to detect offenses in the entire territory of India. We have Directorate of Revenue Intelligence, which is the enforcement agency of the Indian customs. Now, the for the protection of wildlife, we have one more arm, which is the Indian customs. They can not only detect a crime at the exit points now, but also at the domestic land. The Indian customs can very much detect the crime and then further hand over the accused and all the wildlife articles which they have gathered during their investigation to the concerned police or to the concerned forest. Now, the second agency which has been inserted and have been empowered under the Wildlife Protection Act. So I'll keep it both in Hindi and English. Somebody saying कि थोड़ा हिंदी में भी बताएं. So Indian Coast Guard have been empowered under the Wildlife Protection Act. इंडियन कोस्ट गार्ड को भी इसमें एम्पावर किया गया वाइल्ड लाइफ प्रोटेक्शन एक्ट के अंदर कि इंडियन कोस्ट गार्ड इन देयर जुरिसडिक्शंस इन द इंडियन वाटर्स दे कैन वेरी मच डिटेक्ट, arrest, seize and search if in case they are suspicious of any person who are indulging into wildlife crimes. तो अब इंडियन कोस्ट गार्ड भी अपनी जुरिसडिक्शंस में जो है वाइल्ड लाइफ क्राइम को डिटेक्ट कर सकता है, जिसके लिए वाइल्ड लाइफ प्रोटेक्शन एक्ट ने उनको एम्पावर करा कि वो अरेस्ट कर सकते हैं किसी को भी नेशनल वाटर्स में ड्यूरिंग देयर पेट्रोलिंग. इफ दे कम अक्रॉस एनी सच पर्सन तो वो अरेस्ट कर सकते हैं. कोई भी वाइल्ड लाइफ कॉन्ट्राबैंड मिलता है तो उसको सीज कर सकते हैं. किसी भी वेसल, किसी भी पर्सन को वो जो है सर्च कर सकते हैं. So this is the second agency which have been empowered, and which is actually a great thing that for the protection of wildlife we have two new fighting arms, the Indian Coast Guard and the Indian Customs. तो ये एक बहुत अच्छा जो है प्रावधान इसके अंदर लाया गया कि इंडियन कोस्ट गार्ड और इंडियन कस्टम्स को जो है ऐड किया गया. मगर टेक्निकली स्पीकिंग इंडियन कोस्ट गार्ड और इंडियन कस्टम्स सिर्फ इन्वेस्टिगेट करेंगे, डिटेक्ट करेंगे. जहां तक बात कोर्ट में प्रोसिक्यूशन फर्दर इन्वेस्टिगेशन की है मैटर में, तो दे आर नॉट empowered. I'll repeat again in English. Indian Coast Guard and Indian Customs can only detect the offense. They can search, they can arrest, they can seize the articles from the offenders. But then later on, they have to hand over the accused and the entire case property either to the concerned state police or to the forest department of the concerned state. So these were the two agencies which have been added. Now we'll go further as to about the alien species. One of the big issue which we are facing in India, and you will see that a lot of Indian habitat, native wildlife habitat has been destructed due to the invasive alien species. तो invasive alien species क्या है उसको define किया गया. सेक्शन 16A क्लॉज 2 में invasive alien species को amendment act के अंदर जो है ऐड किया गया और उसको define किया गया, which says that any species of animal or plant which is not to India and whose introduction or spread may threaten or adversely impact of wildlife or its habitat. तो परिभाषा बड़ी जो है सिंपल है. कोई भी ऐसी जो स्पीशीज है प्लांट या एनिमल की जो कि नेटिव नहीं है इंडिया के लिए और उसका इंट्रोडक्शन हमारे वाइल्ड लाइफ हैबिटेट के लिए जो है वो काफी ज्यादा जो है नुकसानदेही है, वो काफी थ्रेटन कर सकता है जो है वाइल्ड लाइफ को और उसके हैबिटेट को. तो ये ऐसी इन्वेसिव एलियन स्पीशीज हैं जो कि इंडिया में नहीं मिलती थी. कुछ प्लांट स्पीशीज हैं, कुछ फिश स्पीशीज हैं जिससे आज बहुत प्रॉब्लम हो रही है ऑल ओवर इंडिया. सो वी विल सी व्हाट आर दीज इन्वेसिव एलियन स्पीशीज. So invasive alien species have been defined And a few other recourses have also been mentioned in the new law, which has been introduced, that how we can control the invasive alien species, or how we can get rid of them, and how central government would actually help the state governments in order to get rid of this issue of invasive alien species. तो ये थी इन्वेसिव एलियन स्पीशीज। इसका थोड़ा सा बैकग्राउंड में देखते हैं कि इंडिया में कौन कौन सी इन्वेसिव एलियन स्पीशीज हैं एंड व्हाट्स गोइंग ऑन। सो इट्स अ बिग थ्रेट टू द वाइल्ड लाइफ एंड इट्स हैबिटेट, एंड दिस इज वन ऑफ द रीसेंट रिसर्च which was published by the British Ecological Society, which says that 66% of India's natural areas are actually threatened by the invasive plant species. तो अगर जो लोग फॉरेस्ट बैकग्राउंड से हैं वो देख सकते हैं दैट देयर इज अ बंगाल टाइगर एंड देयर इज दिस प्लांट स्पीशीज व्हिच इज द इन्वेसिव एलियन स्पीशीज, इट्स कॉल्ड लेंटेना। तो लेंटेना का काफी ज्यादा एक ऐसा प्लांट है जिसका काफी मेनस है इंडिया के अंदर। और जो लेमैन है, ऑल्दो आई एम आल्सो नॉट फ्रॉम द साइंस बैकग्राउंड, बट एज फार एज आई नो एंड आई हैव रेड, तो ये ऐसा प्लांट है कि जहां पे भी उग रहा है तो ये बाकी जो हमारे नेटिव जो प्लांट्स हैं ये वहां पे उनको नहीं उगने देता, और इसकी जो ग्रोथ है वो बहुत ज्यादा जो है तेज होती है। तो इस चक्कर में जो हमारे नेटिव प्लांट्स हैं उनका काफी ज्यादा डिस्ट्रक्शन हुआ, वी हैव लॉस्ट अ लॉट ऑफ फॉरेस्ट एरियाज वेयर वी हैव आवर नेटिव प्लांट स्पीशीज। तो वी हैव लॉस्ट अ लॉट बिकॉज ऑफ दिस इन्वेसिव प्लांट स्पीशीज कॉल्ड lantana, which you can see. And as per this recent report, 66% of the India's natural areas are actually threatened. And we'll see what is this the other types of invasive plant species apart from lantana. Next slide. So this is a moss flower. This is also a kind of an invasive plant species which is found in India. And the other one is the lantana, which we have, which you have already seen on the slide. And I'll show you a better picture of the lantana in the next slide. So this is lantana camara. This is most probably introduced through Australia or maybe South America, as far as I have read. Either from South America or from Australia it was introduced, and it has caused a havoc in many parts of the national parks in southern India and also in the Himalayas. One of the invasive animal species which is of a big concern in Kerala, which is seen in the next slide, is the alligator gar. So this is one of the species which have been introduced to our native wildlife habitat. It is not native to India, and this is also causing a great havoc, particularly in the Kerala. So this is a local fisherman which has caught this alligator gar. It is most probably found in the Middle East, and now it has been found in the local waters of the Kerala. So these are few examples of the invasive alien species, and it was a high time that such a law was required to first address this problem and how we can curb from this alarming situation and how we can get rid of this. For this, one provision in the law was has been inserted in the recent amendment, and you will see it is the section 62A, which talks about the invasive alien species and the regulation and the prohibition. So without the permission from the central government, nobody can now actually trade or import anything, can't be done of the invasive alien species. And you will see the content which has been marked in red, that the central government would actually take steps for the destruction, for the disposal through destruction of the invasive alien species. Any species which is causing a threat to the wildlife or habitat in India. So the clause second says that the central government, number one, seize, and number second, dispose of, including through destruction. So before this amendment, the biggest issue before the state government, state forest departments were that to destroy such invasive alien species of plant, so a lot of capital is required. So with the coming of this amendment and the insertion of this new provision, the central government would now aid the state governments to destroy this. So yeah, to destroy, to dispose of these invasive alien species, and for which the fundings would be done. तो मैं हिंदी में भी बता देता हूँ, as somebody is asking, आलम जी is asking to ट्रांसलेटेड इन हिंदी। तो इन्वेजिव एलियन स्पीशीज का ये प्रोविजन आया सेक्शन 62A। तो 62A जो है वो ये बात करता है कि इन्वेजिव एलियन स्पीशीज, जो मैंने आपको भी बताया कि वो ऐसी स्पीशीज हैं जो कि इंडिया में नहीं मिलती, बाहर से इंट्रोड्यूस हुई। ऐसे कुछ प्लांट्स हैं, ऐसे कुछ एनिमल्स हैं जो कि इंडिया के लिए नेटिव नहीं थे, बट उनको इंट्रोड्यूस करा गया इंडिया में, थ्रू इंपोर्ट हुआ। और आज उनकी ग्रोथ की वजह से जो है हमारी जो अपना वाइल्ड लाइफ है उसके लिए काफी थ्रेटनिंग सिचुएशन हो गई। और कैसे कुछ प्लांट स्पीशीज हैं जो कि इन्वेजिव एलियन स्पीशीज के चक्कर में जो है जिनकी ग्रोथ नहीं हो पा रही है। और काफी बड़े बड़े नेशनल पार्क के एरियाज में ये इन्वेजिव एलियन स्पीशीज ही आ गई हैं, जिसके रेमुनरेशंस, रिपरकशंस जो हैं वो बहुत ही डायर हैं। अगर आप देखें कि कुछ ऐसे प्लांट स्पीशीज हैं कि उनके जो है ग्रो करने से, जैसे कि वायनाड करके जगह है, नेशनल पार्क है, टाइगर रिजर्व है, वहां पे जो जो वाइल्ड, जो वन्य जीव, जो वाइल्ड एनिमल्स, जो प्लांट्स और ऐसे बुशेस जो कि उनके लिए कैमोफ्लॉज की तरह काम करते थे, आज वो सारे प्लांट स्पीशीज, वो सारे पेड़ पौधे जा चुके हैं, वहां पे ये एलियन स्पीशीज आ गई हैं। और अब इसके लिए भी आप देखेंगे तो कई कई जगहों पे वो एम्बुश का काम जो पहले जंगल की घास करती थी और प्लांट्स करते थे, वो नहीं कर रहे क्योंकि ये उग गए हैं। तो इसको, इस प्रॉब्लम को हटाने के लिए, क्योंकि इसमें पैसा बहुत ज्यादा लगता है इनको हटाने के लिए, इनको डिस्ट्रॉय करने के लिए, तो जो पार्लियामेंट ने ये प्रोविजन इसमें लाया कि जो भारत सरकार है वो एड करेगी स्टेट गवर्नमेंट को, राज्य सरकार को पैसा देके कि वो उसको डिस्ट्रॉय करें और वो सीज करें। और कोई भी व्यक्ति जो है इसको इंपोर्ट या इसका ट्रेड में विदाउट सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट के जो है वो नहीं कर सकता, वो वर्जित है। तो इस तरह के प्रोविजन लाए गए विच आर वेरी मच इंपॉर्टेंट टू एड्रेस दिस प्रॉब्लम ऑफ इन्वेसिव एलियन स्पीशीज। नाउ वील गो फर्दर। This was the invasive alien species. Now, person. So see, just it's we'll skip it. It's just that the person definition has been now elaborated. Earlier, also it included firm or company. So it's just we'll skip the definition of person because there is nothing more. Now, this is important. Now you see, if any one of you, if I am hoping few of you have gone through the Wildlife Protection Act, और जो पुराना वाइल्ड लाइफ प्रोटेक्शन एक्ट था उसके अंदर शेड्यूल 6 था, जिसके अंदर 6 प्लांट्स पाए जाते थे, स्पेसिफाइड प्लांट्स। सो नॉट ओनली दैट द वाइल्ड लाइफ प्रोटेक्शन एक्ट प्रोटेक्ट्स द वाइल्ड एनिमल्स, बट इट आल्सो प्रोटेक्ट्स द स्पेसिफाइड plants which are found in wild. So earlier, before the amendment, there was a schedule 6 which mentioned 6 kinds of specified plants which were accorded protection by the Wildlife Protection Act. Now, this is also one of the major changes in the Wildlife Protection Act. With this amendment, now you can see that from 6, there are total now 19 specified plants which have now added. And the older ones are only 4, and 15 of the new specified plants have been added. तो ऐसे 15 नए प्लांट्स स्पीशीज जो हैं वो और ऐड हुई हैं, और वो आज के शेड्यूल 3 में पाए जाते हैं वाइल्ड लाइफ प्रोटेक्शन एक्ट के, जहां पे how does the IA section deal with? Sir, we'll take the questions at the end, but I appreciate the queries. Once we are done with the our lecture, I'll only take 10 to 15 minutes now and we'll wind up, then we can have a question answer round. So 15 ऐसे प्लांट की स्पीशीज हैं जो कि वाइल्ड लाइफ प्रोटेक्शन एक्ट में जो है वो ऐड हुई, इससे पहले 6 थी। So this is also that 15 new specified plants which are native to India have been given protection under the new amendment act. Next, please. Yes. So this is important when we talk about wildlife criminal law. So now this amendment, which you can see on the screen, is the relevant part of the statutory provision. No renewal of any license. So before the Wildlife Amendment Act, there was this provision, section 34 in the Wildlife Protection Act, which talked about that if in case anybody has an arms license, or if in case anybody from by any other law is keeping a licensed firearm and is living within the radius of 10 kilometers of a wildlife sanctuary or a national park, so that person, that license holder, has to intimate the concerned forest department about the acquiring of such firearm by way of a whatsoever arms license somebody is having. So that person has to intimate the forest department if in case he is living in the radius of 10 kilometers of a wildlife sanctuary or a national park. Now the act further adds to that provision that any renewal of the license. So earlier the law was if in case anybody is having, so, or if in case anybody is applying, so it should be with the intimation to the chief wildlife warden of the wildlife department of the state. Now the act adds one more thing, and it talks about that the renewal of any license. Let's say there is a man who has acquired a firearm, and he has intimated the forest department that he is living within the 10 kilometers radius of a national park or a sanctuary, and he has this make of a firearm with a license. But now it is the time that his license is expiring, and now he has to get it renewed to the civil authorities. So the Wildlife Protection Act now says that if in case anybody goes for the renewal of the firearm and is living within the radius of 10 kilometers of a wildlife sanctuary, then also he has to intimate the forest department. And forest department may then take recourse or may then consult with the 10-kilometer air distance is not mentioned whether it is 10-kilometer air distance or by land. That is a good question. In fact, somebody asked me before, 10 kilometers of a sanctuary, whether it has to be measured from air or by road. So that's a good question, but I don't have the answer for that. I think if we have any forest officer, senior forest officer as a participant, so he can very much tell whether 10 kilometers is aerial distance or by road, by land. So I'll translate it to Hindi. तो ये जो प्रोविजन आया, ये प्रोविजन ये कहता है कि किसी को भी अगर अपना आर्म्स लाइसेंस रिन्यू कराना है और वो 10 किलोमीटर के दायरे में रहता है किसी भी नेशनल पार्क या सेंचुरी के, तो उसके लिए उसको परमिशन लेनी होगी फॉरेस्ट डिपार्टमेंट से। अब चेंजेस क्या है? पहले कानून ये था कि अगर आपके पास आर्म्स लाइसेंस है और आप 10 किलोमीटर के रेडियस में रहते हो, तो आपको जो है इंटीमेट करना है फॉरेस्ट डिपार्टमेंट को कि आपके पास जो है एक लाइसेंसी हथियार है और आप सेंचुरी के 10 किलोमीटर के दायरे में रह रहे। मगर अब क्या है कि एक इशू और था कि किसी ने बता दिया मगर किसी का रिन्यूअल हो रहा है, तो रिन्यूअल के लिए भी फॉरेस्ट डिपार्टमेंट को बताया जाएगा। और इससे कानून की मंशा ये है कि रिन्यूअल ना हो तो फॉरेस्ट डिपार्टमेंट वो सिविल अथॉरिटीज के साथ जो है दे कैन कोऑर्डिनेट that these persons, maybe they are history cheater or they are criminals or they are indulging into wildlife crimes. So then the forest department can actually consult with the civil authorities that the license of these people who are holding arms license, the license of such person should not be renewed. So this is one of the important amendment, and it is actually required that forest department should also be the discretion as to who should keep firearms if he is living in the vicinity of a national park or a sanctuary. Because India में बहुत जगह पे आप देखेंगे कि स्पेशली कश्मीर में वहाँ पे कल्चर भी है आर्म्स लाइसेंस रखने का, बट वहाँ पे वी ऑल नो कि आर्म्स लाइसेंस इशूइंग अथॉरिटी जो है वो सिविल अथॉरिटी डिस्ट्रिक्ट मैजिस्ट्रेट होता है। यूनियन टेरिटरीज में पुलिस के पास भी पावर है, मगर फॉरेस्ट डिपार्टमेंट जो है दे बिकम हेल्पलेस। So now for the renewal, the civil authorities have to also intimate the forest department that this person stays within 10 kilometers of a national park and so there the concurrence of the chief wildlife warden, the forest department, is required. So this is about the arms license in the amendment. Now we see that now if you see from the enforcement perspective, अब ये जो provision है section 39, so it is important from the perspective of a enforcement officer. There are cases where, for example, police, forest department, customs, they would seize live animals, and when these live animals are seized by an offender, the offender is arrested, and then the offender is taken to the jurisdictional criminal court, the Ilaka magistrate, we say. So there sometimes the question is as to where the live animals would go, because the offender usually takes this plea sometimes, which I have come across such issues in Punjab and in other places, that live wild pigs were seized in a raid, and then the person was arrested, and then the wild pigs were taken to the court that, okay, this is the case property which we have seized from the offender. And now sometimes the defense would take this plea that it's a case property, so it should not be set free. But the question is, where can we actually keep such live animals? If you see from the enforcement perspective, let's say there is a ranger who has seized a truck full of like say parakeets or some apes, and the person is arrested, but the criminal procedure law says that the case property which you have seized from the offender has to be taken to the jurisdictional criminal court, the Ilaka magistrate. So when you take it, so sometimes the issue is, okay, now where this live animals would go, whether they have to be set free in the wild. Obviously, the common sense says that from wheresoever they have been captured, they should be set free in the sanctuary. But sometimes the situation is that they are in transit and they are taken from a very remote places of a national park, and the animals are seized in a city, and we can't take them back to the national parks. So there was this the law was silent earlier as to what can be such a situation. So what was happening before was also not that problematic, because the judicial officers are very much sensitive and are aware that the wild animal comes from the wild, so it should go to the wild, and not it. We can't keep it in the forest office, or we can't keep them in the court, because they have been captured from the wild. So earlier also, before the Amendment Act, the such live animals were setting free back in the wild. The forest department was tasked to take them back from wheresoever they have been captured. But the provision was not clear. So it was only the judges who were applying their judicial mind with the help of the forest department, that what can be done of the live parrots, of the live wild pigs. However, with this amendment, you see the subclause 4 of section 39, and it says, where any such government property is a live animal, the state government ensure that it is housed and cared for by a recognized zoo or rescue center, where it cannot be released to its natural habitat. So yes, so earlier also that was the situation. Let's say I am in New Delhi and there is no national park nearby. There is a bunch of wild animals which have been caught, let's say from Himachal, and they have been trafficked to Delhi. And the forest department or the Delhi police have apprehended the vehicle, and then the animals have been seized. Now the animals belong to a wildlife sanctuary in Himachal Pradesh. So where it is to be taken? The answer is that it has to be taken back to their natural habitat from where it has been seized. But for the time being, the law now very much clarifies that if in case it cannot be released to their natural habitat, so in that case, for the time being, it has to be kept in the recognized zoo or rescue center. So it is a very important provision which has been added, and a lot of confusion has been actually eradicated after the insertion of this provision. And the reason is that sometimes what was happening before this amendment, live animals which were seized and were taken before the court, the the court were asking the forest department or the police to set them free back to from wheresoever they have been captured. The question was, it was requiring some time. So for the time being, to take them back to their natural habitat, they were to be taken where them to be taken. Now there was no provision which says that they can for the time being be kept under the care and supervision of a recognized zoo of the city, or to some rescue center which is run by an NGO. So it was not mentioned in the law. So this issue has now been solved by very clearly mentioning that if in case they can't be taken to the natural habitat, they should be taken to a recognized zoo and to the rescue center. मैं इसको हिंदी में बता देता हूँ एक बार. लाइव एनिमल के केसेस में पहले ये प्रॉब्लम आती थी, हर जगह पे नहीं आ रही थी, कुछ जगह पे आ रही थी, कि अगर किसी सिटी के अंदर लाइव एनिमल्स कोई रेड हुई और लाइव एनिमल्स जो हैं उसमें जब्त किए गए और ऑफेंडर्स पकड़े गए, तो अब ये लाइव एनिमल्स कहाँ जाएंगे? अगर लाइव एनिमल्स कैप्चर बहुत दूर दराज इलाके से हुए, तो प्रॉब्लम ये आ रही थी कि इनको कहाँ रखा जाए. ऑब्वियसली उनको रिकॉग्नाइज जू या रेस्क्यू सेंटर में ही रख सकते हैं, क्योंकि फॉरेस्ट डिपार्टमेंट में कभी कभार इतनी जगह नहीं है, लैंड नहीं है, या फिर रिसोर्सेज नहीं है वाइल्ड एनिमल्स को रखने की, जब तक कि उनको हम उनके वाइल्ड लाइफ नेचुरल हैबिटेट में नहीं छोड़ाते. तो रिकॉग्नाइज जू और रेस्क्यू सेंटर्स में ही उनको रख सकते थे फॉर द टाइम बिंग. मगर ऐसा कुछ प्रावधान में लिखा नहीं था पहले वाइल्ड लाइफ प्रोटेक्शन एक्ट में. तो वो कहीं ना कहीं पे प्रॉब्लम आ रही थी कि फॉरेस्ट डिपार्टमेंट अगर जू तो कुछ परमिशन नहीं है, किस बिहाफ पे वो जू में जाके उन जानवरों को रख सकता है. तो अब ये जो उपधारा 4 आई, धारा 39 की, इसके अंदर ये बड़ा क्लियर हो गया कि अगर नेचुरल हैबिटेट में उनको नहीं भेज सकते, तो उनको जो है रिकॉग्नाइज जू और जो है रेस्क्यू सेंटर्स में रखा जाए. तो ये था प्रोविजन अबाउट द लाइव एनिमल्स. नेक्स्ट, inclusion of sites most probably will be taking another session on the sites, where I'll talk about the sites, what is sites and what is the purpose of sites. But अभी अमेंडमेंट के लिए इतना जानना हमारे लिए जरूरी है कि साइट्स का इंक्लूजन हो गया वाइल्ड लाइफ प्रोटेक्शन एक्ट में. सो व्हाट इज साइट इज मेंशन्ड ऑन द स्क्रीन. It's actually an international law which talks about the trade of wild animals and wild plants. It is there to protect, but the theme is sustainable trade of wild animals. For example, मेरे को अफ्रीका से जो है पैरट्स लेके यहाँ पे आने हैं, तो वो बैन नहीं है, एक सस्टेनेबल ट्रेड हो कि वहां की गवर्नमेंट, अफ्रीकन स्टेट्स की और इंडियन गवर्नमेंट को पता रहे कि अंतरराष्ट्रीय ट्रेड कितना चल रहा है. तो उसके लिए जो है साइटेस के सिग्नेटरी इंडिया भी है. और आप देखेंगे कि इसका पर्पस जो है, जैसे कि मैंने बताया कि is to ensure that wild fauna and flora in international trade are not exploited unsustainably. So CITES it provides for a common mechanism, common procedural mechanism. There are more than 190 countries now which are signatories to the CITES. It was enacted back in 1975. India is also a signatory, but there were many things which were not enforced. We being the signatory of CITES, we have not enforced the provisions or the mandate of CITES. So now with this amendment act, we have enforced the mandate of the CITES. तो CITES हम उसमें देखेंगे, बट CITES में हुआ क्या कि भारत केंद्र सरकार ने 2 अथॉरिटीज बनाई अमेंडमेंट एक्ट आने के बाद. मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटी, साइंटिफिक अथॉरिटी. नटशेल में बता देता हूँ. फर्स्ट आई टेल इन इंग्लिश that the management authority would deal in the import export of the exotic species of animals and plants if somebody wants to buy it, if somebody want to import export it. So management authority is the one which would keep track of all the species which have been imported or exported. And if in case, let's say I bring 2 parrots from some foreign country, so even if they are laying eggs or if they have died, everything has to be reported to the management authority. Whether the animals can be imported, exported, whether there is threat to that very species which I being an individual want to import it or export it, the management authority would decide it. So it's on the discretion of the management authority, and the management authority would give me the permits to import and export. तो मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटी का काम है इंपोर्ट एक्सपोर्ट देखना, एक पूरा रिकॉर्ड बनाना कि इंडिया के अंदर कितने लोगों के पास एग्जॉटिक फॉरेन ब्रीड्स के बर्ड्स और एनिमल्स हैं. On the other hand, scientific authority would deal with whether such import or export is detrimental to our native wild animals and to our wild habitat or not. Can we introduce some number of species from outside? What are the detrimental effects on our native species? So scientific authority will be working with the management authority, and management authority would be taking reports from the scientific authority about what all species can be introduced in India if somebody want to trade. Let's say an individual wants to trade in some animal X. So if the management authority is of the opinion that, okay, it may be detrimental to bring this number of species in India, so they will take reports of the scientific authority. And the scientific authority would give the reasoning as to whether it is right or it is detrimental to our wildlife or habitat to introduce such species from the foreign land. साइंटिफिक अथॉरिटी का काम है कि वो असिस्ट करेगा मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटी को कि इंपोर्ट एक्सपोर्ट कौन कौन सी स्पीशीज में होना चाहिए, या इंडिया में ऐसी कुछ थ्रेटेंड स्पीशीज हैं जिनका जो है हमें एक्सपोर्ट नहीं करना चाहिए, और कुछ स्पीशीज का हमें इंपोर्ट नहीं करना चाहिए. साइंटिफिकली वो कैसे जो है नुकसानदेह हो सकता है हमारे अपने वन्य जीव के लिए, वन्य प्राणियों के लिए. तो वो सारी चीजें जो है साइंटिफिक अथॉरिटी मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटी को बताएगी. अगर आप देखेंगे मिनिस्ट्री ऑफ एनवायरनमेंट की वेबसाइट पे जाके, तो आपको पता कि साइंटिफिक अथॉरिटी ऑलरेडी जो है वो नोटिफाई कर दी गई है. जूलॉजिकल सर्वे ऑफ इंडिया जैसे हो गया, बोटानिकल सर्वे ऑफ इंडिया, ये साइंटिफिक अथॉरिटीज के अंदर आ रहा है. मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटी में आप देखेंगे इंस्पेक्टर जनरल ऑफ फॉरेस्ट, जो कि मिनिस्ट्री ऑफ एनवायरनमेंट में एक पोजीशन है, तो इंस्पेक्टर जनरल ऑफ फॉरेस्ट वो मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटी में आएंगे. सीनियर ऑफिसर्स फ्रॉम वाइल्ड लाइफ क्राइम कंट्रोल ब्यूरो वो मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटी में जो है वो आएंगे. सो दिस इज अबाउट द साइटेज एंड द मैंडेट ऑफ मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटी एंड साइंटिफिक अथॉरिटी हमने फॉलो किया. 49D शेड्यूल स्पेसिमेन, तो इनको शेड्यूल स्पेसिमेन बोल रहा है वाइल्ड लाइफ प्रोटेक्शन एक्ट कि जितनी फॉरेन स्पीशीज हैं जो कि इंडिया को नेटिव नहीं है, तो ये शेड्यूल स्पेसिमेन होगा जो कि साइटिस के कन्वेंशन में है. और आप देखें कि कुछ 38 to 39,000 स्पीशीज है प्लांट्स और एनिमल्स की फॉरेन स्पीशीज. तो वो जो है इंट्रोड्यूस की प्रोटेक्शन एक्ट में 38 to 39,000 स्पीशीज अभी साइटिस के अंदर आ गई हैं. और ये शेड्यूल 4 जो है वाइल्ड लाइफ प्रोटेक्शन एक्ट का, उसके अंदर जो है इन सबको प्रोटेक्शन मिल गई. मैं बस इसमें एक पॉइंट बताना चाहूंगा एंड वी आर रनिंग आउट ऑफ टाइम. पहले क्या इशू हो रहा था कि इंडियन एनफोर्समेंट एजेंसीज जब भी कोई एग्जॉटिक बर्ड या एनिमल जो है वो पकड़ रही थी, तो कोई लॉ नहीं था जिसमें हम प्रोसिक्यूट कर पाए ऑफेंडर को. एक आदमी इंडियन पैराकीट्स के ट्रेड कर रहा है, so that is an offense under the Wildlife Protection Act if somebody is illegally trading in the Indian parrots. So it was such Indian parrots were protected under the Indian Wildlife Protection Act. But if somebody was actually doing trade in, like say, some African parrots or South American parrots, African macaw, and the enforcement agency were actually getting information that person X is indulging into such trade in exotic species and there is no check of breeding and all. So there was no law for the protection of the foreign species of parrots. And there were so many cases in Delhi where in fact I informed the enforcement agencies that look, this person is dealing in such animals or such birds, but they were helpless that these all are international species which have no protection under the Wildlife Protection Act. Now with this amendment, one of the major challenges which were there before the enforcement agencies have now been actually addressed, and that is now all these 39,000 foreign animal and plant species have been given protection under the domestic legislation, which is the Wildlife Protection Act. Similarly, all these species now, new provision says that a trade cannot be done under this and nobody can possess. So these were the provisions related to CITES, that protection to the foreign species have been now extended to the foreign species under the Wildlife Protection Act. Next. enhanced penalties. So this is on your screen. If somebody is from the forest department, can take a screenshot of this. This is how the enhancement has been done on the penalty side. Punishment remains the same as you can see on the screen. जिसमें punishment 3 साल की थी, उसमें 1 लाख का जुर्माना कर दिया गया। पहले सिर्फ 25,000 तक जा रहा था। जहां पे 3 से 7 साल की पनिशमेंट थी, वहां पे जो पनिशमेंट है वो 25,000 से लेके जो है पहले 10,000 थी, अब उसमें नॉट लेस देन 25,000 है। तो 3 से 7 साल के जो ऑफेंसेस है, फॉर एग्जाम्पल नेशनल पार्क के अंदर टाइगर कोर एरियाज में टाइगर रिजर्व्स के या फिर शेड्यूल 1 एनिमल के साथ कुछ भी हो रहा है, तो वो 3 से 7 साल के ऑफेंसेस हैं। वहां पे पनिशमेंट 3 to 7 जाती है। तो वहां पे मिनिमम फाइन ऑफ 25,000 कर दिया और मैक्सिमम कोई कैप नहीं है फाइन की। सो दिस इज हाउ द पेनल्टीज हैव बीन एनहांस्ड अंडर द वाइल्ड लाइफ प्रोटेक्शन एक्ट। द लास्ट थिंग is provision of compounding of offense. So the forest department has the power to compound the offenses. Earlier, the compounding fees was up to 25,000. That if somebody commits a crime, and it is not that in a serious crime the forest department will compound. मैं हिंदी में बताता हूँ, कंपाउंड करना मतलब कि क्षमा कर देना। किसी ने कोई ऑफेंस करा छोटा, तो फॉरेस्ट डिपार्टमेंट पे ही पावर है कि उसको जो है माफ कर दिया, उससे कुछ पैसे लेके कंपाउंड कर दिया। जिस तरह हम ट्रैफिक चलान करते हैं सड़कों पे, जब हम जाता है तब हम ट्रायल नहीं होता हमारे ऊपर, एफआईआर नहीं होती, हम कंपाउंडिंग फीस दे देते हैं, जो भी फाइन होता है 2,000 रुपए। सिमिलरली फॉरेस्ट डिपार्टमेंट भी जो है, पहले 25,000 तक का प्रावधान था। इट वॉज ओनली टिल अप टू 25,000 रुपीज दैट द फॉरेस्ट डिपार्टमेंट कैन लीवाई when they were compounding offenses, and these are all small offenses, not the heinous offenses which can be compounded. So earlier the compounding fees was only 25,000, which has now been extended to 5 lakhs. So now the forest department can actually take up to 5 lakh rupees if in case they want somebody to get the offense compounded. So that's a huge thing, and this huge amount would actually serve as a big deterrent to people who are indulging into petty wildlife crimes. So for now, earlier they were paying up to 25,000 to get the offense compounded. Now the forest has the discretion to actually levy up to 5 lakh rupees as a compounding fee. So next, I think with this, yes, we are done. And now we'll take up the queries. We have some questions.
Lovish, can you see the chat box?
Can you just get the people mute? I think there is somebody talking. I'm just checking the chat box.
Yeah. If anyone has any question, please feel free to drop your question in the chat box, so we can take it one by one and Lavish can answer it.
This is one question from Farida. How does the IAS section deal with the invasive animal species like spotted deers in A and Ireland? Can you just get the other participants muted?
Yeah, so there was a question, Lavish. I think it's very important. So people has a great confusion and problem regarding exclusion of rhesus macaque monkey. Can you please elaborate? Is it excluded, not excluded? What they can do it with the rhesus macaque now?
Where is the question?
It's a top. So the first question was there. There is a great confusion and problem regarding exclusion of rhesus monkey.
There is a great confusion and problem regarding exclusion of rhesus monkeys.
Yeah.
So whether they have been excluded or not from the schedule, that has to be seen, and I plead my ignorance on this part. Racist monkey. First of all, this question is not whether they've been excluded from the schedule or they have been considered as a woman. So I'm not getting the question. So
So
the
I think they,
confusion
I think
regard.
they want to ask whether it is protected now or not, excluded from the schedule, or in
I
the
think
schedule
for
now.
that, we can get back to the to Mr. Sandeep because I also
Yes.
have checked whether they are mentioned in the
No,
schedule
no,
or not. I have
no.
not
No,
seen the schedules whether
then
they are
why,
mentioned.
as per Wildlife Act, now the monkeys have been uh, excluded from the Wildlife Act, and it has been told to local authorities to take their care.
Yes.
For example, like dogs and other stray animals, they will not be called as wild animals now.
So now they
So,
will be accorded protection under the PSC Act, which we have,
yes,
where there is
yes,
a
yes, yes.
Prevention of
Ah,
Animals from Cruelty Act. So they will be given protection under that act if in case they are excluded from the schedule of the Wildlife Protection Act.
but their habitat is forests. How they can be separated from wild? And moreover, wildlife department has somewhat expertise to handle these animals.
Right.
And
With this, I think the forest department has to work more now in the cities or
yes,
maybe
yes.
in the yes. So that is actually a policy thing. Maybe the decision is wrong, or maybe given that we have so much diversity in India, so maybe it may have resolved some issues in some parts of country and has now created problem in other parts of country. So that
Yeah,
is
yeah.
the issue, why
Yes, yes, yes.
enacting the provisions,
Hmm.
maybe there are some parts of the countries which are missed.
Ah.
So something which is beneficial in one part of the country can be problematic in the other part.
Nee, it will be great problem for the local authorities, even animal husbandry. They cannot handle even dogs, but how they will handle the monkeys?
But then the point is, even if we give protection to the monkeys, the menace which is caused by the monkeys would still remain the same.
But however, they can tranquilize them, they can sterilize them, but
So
there
for
is no policy on the front of local
for,
authorities.
for tranquilization, now maybe the state government, the municipalities would be trained to tranquilize the way they have been handling dogs. No, they'll be handling the monkeys. Although I completely agree that forest department is at a better footing to deal with
Yes, yes.
the
Uh,
monkeys, given if it goes from the purview of the protection which is given by the forest department or the expertise which they have to deal with such animals, I think it would be a big issue before the local authorities. But maybe they'll get training from the forest department with time.
yeah, yeah. Sure. Anyway, thank you.
Sure, sure, sure.
There's another question, Lavish. A person is asking whether sanctuary includes all protected areas or not.
Sorry.
Whether the
I think
sanctuary term includes all protected areas.
so. See, for the centuries, there is a provision given for the national parks, and the century. When we say century, so the provision which are applicable to century are also applicable to national park and other parts, uh,
Yeah.
like community reserves and all, for which there are specific provisions in the Wildlife Protection Act. So if you see the Wildlife Protection Act, it first starts with the provisions of the century, and it talks about what is an offense in the century or not. But then the other
Yeah.
chapter, when it jumps to national park, so the same protection or the same acts which have been termed as offenses in the century have also been termed as a offense in the national park. So it depends. For example, if the provision of renewal of arm license are concerned, so that would also be applicable to a national park, not only to the century.
Great. Thanks. And there's a one question. Yeah.
Pradipti says
Yeah.
compounding fee is charged per person or per offense. It is all the discretion of the forest department, Pradipti, and you are also well aware about the provision and how the forest department is currently working. So the compounding fee would be charged, no doubt, if there are 5 offenders, so it will be charged as to one person. On person, they will be charging. Let's say it's a 5 lakh rupees. Because see, the if in case the offense is not, I'll tell you the reason why it would be per person. Because if in case the man goes to trial, it is all four which will be serving the punishment separately. It is not that a 5 person, do some wildlife offense and then they are convicted for 5 years of imprisonment, and then one fifth is actually divided into 5 parts because there are 5 person. So because the punishment is also separate, so the compounding fees is also separate. So you will usually, mostly you will see, I don't think that the department was actually divide the compounding fee into number of persons and then divide it into equal parts. So if there is a 5 lakh, let's say, the compounding fees, and there are three accused persons which are involved in a case, so the department would actually levy 5 lakhs per person. It can't do 1.5, 1.5. So this is what usually, not only in the forest offense, but also in other penal statute, if you see, this is how the compounding would take place. Before that, this is from Shrinjoy. Hey Lavish, as you are aware, these are locals in many places where there are possessions of firearms, citing self-protection and engage in hunting activities illegally. Is there any act or workaround to combat the same? So Shrinjoy is actually a good friend of mine, and I can very much understand from where this question is coming. And so there's a lot of people who are from the army background in Himachal Pradesh, and they are in possession of the firearms, and they do have the valid license also. So for the self protection and for even for the protection of their crops, their standing crops, there are provisions in the Arms Act as to under what circumstances any person can acquire the license. So they can very much keep it, but in the garb of self protection, or for, let's say, in the garb of anything, if they are actually doing hunting activities, so anybody can do anything from a licensed firearm. That's why we have this provision. If you have a firearm and you stay within 10-kilometer radius of any sanctuary, then you need to intimate to the forest department. And not only that, it's the person's duty, it also the forest department to keep track of such people by actually coordinating with the local authorities, the licensing units, that as to in these area how many people have acquired the firearms. So yes, many people really do that. And we, Srinjoy also knows, Srinjoy, I also know there are people who in the garb of for acquiring their, for protecting their land, standing crops, and for self protection, they have acquired the licenses, and now they are misusing the firearms. And but the question remains that it is the enforcement agency on the ground who have to keep a check on such notorious people who are using their licensed firearms for causing harm to the wildlife and for the hunting thing. And it's very much common in Himachal Pradesh. We'll come to the next question. Does these acts include marine wildlife or just the terrestrial ones? So it includes all. If you read the definition of what is wildlife, so it's including everything. So the definition would help you in this. Exotic species, live exotic bred in India, Mr. Sandeep Jain. But in case of rescue center, there are no special provisions of special species. Rescue center definition, kindly elaborate. Sir, Sandeep ji, rescue centers have not been defined. So usually rescue centers are run by the NGOs only. And for the exotic species, if they are actually apprehended, offenders are apprehended and exotic species are seized in some cases. So for that, the enforcement agency, in my knowledge, would take records of the NGOs who have a better understanding of how to keep an exotic bird or an animal and how to keep it in a safe custody till the time we can take some resources of to transport it back to its native land. And the people from the wildlife industry would better know that in fact there can be something can be done to in fact get these exotic species if they are illegally they have entered India and they have been caught from the offender traders. And now what to be done of these exotic species? So they can very much be sent back to their native land, their native country. There are some protocols available on the international level that how we can actually send back such exotic species to their native land. So, but yeah, coming to your question, rescue centers have not been defined. These are usually run by the NGOs. But if in case anybody comes across exotic species cases, so they should take recourse of the rescue centers or the city zoos, and then one should check about the protocols of sending such species back to their native land. Where can we find recording of this? Okay, this is a 10-kilometer areas distance. As I already said that it is not mentioned that it is 10-kilometer aerial distance or it is by land. I assume that because it pertains to firearms and firearms are kept by humans who walk. So maybe by land we'll compute 10 kilometers radius from the century in order to ascertain what all people have to register their names with the forest department. So I think with this, all the questions have been addressed. What general public can do for the cause of protection of wildlife, whom they can approach? They can very much approach this NGO only, Wildlife Trust of India. You can volunteer. I started, I am a practicing lawyer, but I actually volunteered out of my passion. Years back, I volunteered with the Wildlife Protection Act, Wildlife Trust of India. I gave my free legal services, I gave my legal research, I gave my time to do something which I can, my bit for the protection of the wildlife. So a lot can be done by the general public. You can very much volunteer. You can be aware of the provisions. You can actually be, ears of the enforcement agencies. If you come across any such suspicious activities taking place in your village by someone, you can inform the police, you can inform the NGOs, you can inform the Wildlife Crime Control Bureau, you can inform Forest Department that somebody may indulge in a hunting of a wild animal or somebody is carrying on a commercial business of wildlife. So a lot can be done. Can we hit monkeys or otherwise can dead bodies of wild animals like foxes hit by accident? Can we hit monkeys? Why would you hit monkeys? Like so? I think this you should ask yourself, why would you hit monkeys? There is no point hitting the monkeys.
So,
This
Lavish,
is
I think
Miss Chopra. Anyways, what general public can do, NGOs और जागृत नागरिक के पास अधिकार है कि कोई सस्पेक्ट को रोक कर उसकी चेकिंग करना फॉरेस्ट डिपार्टमेंट से फोन पर परमिशन लेकर, जैसे कि कोई वाइल्ड लाइफ ट्रैकिंग। देखिए, आप बिल्कुल कर सकते हो, मगर बेटर यही रहेगा कि देखिए फॉरेस्ट एक्ट्स में नहीं है मगर जनरल लॉज में है। अगर आप सस्पिशियस हो, और आप हम लोग नहीं है कि बाजारों में कोई चेन स्नैच करता है, कोई वॉलेट चोरी करता है तो पब्लिक ही रोक लेती है, पब्लिक ही सर्च कर लेती है उसको। तो आप बिल्कुल कर सकते हो, बस गिवन कि आप अपने अपनी जान का भी आपको ख्याल होना चाहिए। तो इसलिए बेटर ये है कि हम किसी तरह उनको रोक के रखें। अगर आपको लगता है कि हम चेकिंग करें या ना करें, तो मेरे हिसाब से चेकिंग नहीं करनी चाहिए खुद, क्योंकि आगे जाके अगर क्रिमिनल कोर्ट में केस जा रहा है तो वो बहुत फेटल हो जाएगा कि पुलिस के आगे तो जो है चेकिंग हुई नहीं, और किसी की जेब से कोई वाइल्ड लाइफ आर्टिकल निकला तो वो तो किसी ने देखा ही नहीं, पुलिस के आने से पहले आपने उसके जो है कपड़ों में से या बैग में से निकाल लिया कि ये तो देखो ऐसा जो है अवैध धंधा कर रहा है वाइल्ड एनिमल्स का। तो आपको खुद चेकिंग नहीं करनी चाहिए। आप कर सकते हैं मगर वो आगे जाके केस के लिए बहुत खराब रहेगा। हम किसी को रिस्ट्रेन कर सकते हैं पब्लिक की हेल्प से, और उसके बाद पुलिस और फॉरेस्ट का जो है वी कैन टेक रिकोर्स। The term forest is not defined because it is not concerned with the forest per se. It is concerned with sanctuaries, with the wildlife, wild animal, captive animal, trophies. So that's why the definition of forest is not there. Is it possible? Okay, this is the last question. Is it possible to do research on protected species by bringing to the lab? See, for the protected species, if any scientific research is to be done, yes, you can very much do, but you require permission from the concerned state forest department. So if you get the forest department's permission, the concerned officer would give you permission. You have to give the reasons why you want, what kind of scientific research you want to do in the lab. So it is on the discretion. If the scheduled animal, like let's say for sea cucumber, so now for sea cucumber, Monish would say if it's very much detrimental, or if it's facing it's endangered or it's very threatened and it's close to extinction, maybe the forest department would not give you the permission to do such research. But so it depends on the kind of threat such animal species, wild animal species is facing. But yes, for the lab, you can very much take, you can get the requisite permission under the Wildlife Protection Act from the State Forest Department. With this, I think I have addressed almost all the questions, and it was great joining you all. I hope the session was bit insightful and knowledgeable for all the participants. Although face-to-face interactions are far better, we all know. But with this webinar, we can do pan-India, people can join it. So I hope the time which you have given to us, to the WTI, and I really want to thank the WTI for taking such initiative. I've been training, sensitizing mostly the enforcement agencies, but I think this is the first time I'm seeing people from all walk of life and from different professions, whether they are from the forest department or not, but there are other people from the legal background or from other backgrounds. So I genuinely hope that it was of some knowledge to you, some useful knowledge you have gained. So thank you very much for joining me, and I want to thank WTI again for taking this initiative.
Thank you so
Monish, I
much.
hand it over to you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lovish, first of all, to joining us and sparing some of your time to just, yep, elaborate Wildlife Protection Act and give enlightenment us about the Wildlife Protection Act. I would like to state that there was so many other questions was arising in your mind, must be because it's an act and it's wildlife people should know this act. You can directly write to us if you have any question. We will transfer it to Lavish and we will definitely reach back to you. I have emailed our email ID in the chat box. You can directly write your question to us. And there was a question, two, three question about the certificates. So I would like to tell you, we are coming up with a series of Wildlife Protection Act webinars. So that we will do a certificate course. For that, you need to register. And this we will start most probably from the March or April. So there we can provide a certificate, but it will be like a series of webinars. You have to attend all the session of the webinars. So I think there's a other lot of questions from that. You can directly write to us. And again, I will thank Lavish. Thanks for all the participant, and thank you from Wildlife Trust of India for joining us, giving us the idea of the Wildlife Protection Act. And indeed, there's a lot more to learn about the act because it's a huge. And I would like to thank all the participants for joining us for this session.